So far this morning, we've seen that Abram is surrounded by sin. We're going to see now Abram pleading for sinners. We've reached a key moment again here in the life of Abraham. Here, this friend of God has been made aware of God's plans to judge some sinful people who don't yet love him. How's he going to respond? How does Abram think about those people who live near him who don't yet love God? In the remaining verses of chapter 18, we see a wonderful picture of a man who loves God and who therefore loves the people around him and pleads earnestly for them. It's a curious passage in some ways. Abram's bargaining with God. He asks God to spare Sodom if only there were 50 righteous people in it. So God agrees. And then he bargains God down to 45. God agrees again. And then he repeatedly barters with God and manages to get him down to 40, to 30, to 20, and finally to 10. And at that point, the negotiation ends. Despite the obvious wickedness of the city, Abram knows all about it. Abram pleads with God on behalf of these people. Whatever else this strange conversation tells us, it surely tells us that Abram, the friend of God, is also a friend of sinners. He is in no doubt about Sodom. He knows what kind of a place it is, and yet he loves the people there. Folks, I wonder whether we may need to recover something of this love for the people around us. For too long, we have imagined the church to be a place where nice people like us come to gather together with other nice people like us. We imagine that it's okay to keep our distance from the people around us who don't yet love God. We're content to harbor feelings of moral superiority. We look at the great unwashed out there in the world. Folks, that's not the way of Abraham. Abram pleads with God for the salvation of the people of Sodom. He's an advocate for these sinners, and he's a good friend to them. As he takes on that role, he's giving us a glimpse of Jesus, his great descendant, who made it his business to love sinners for God. We're asking today, how ought we to think about the countless folks around us who don't yet love God? Our colleagues, our neighbour, our spouse. Well, let's learn from Abram. Even more so, let's follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Let's stop judging our neighbours, and let's instead plead with God for their salvation. We've thought about how Abram's surrounded by sin. We've now seen Abram pleading for sinners. We'll close by noticing that even in this difficult passage, God is acting in grace. To talk about God's grace in this chapter, we need to recognize that it comes against the backdrop of God's judgment. I'd like to take a moment just now to invite you to think with me about God's judgment, and I'm going to invite my theology professor, Dr. Packer, to join us in the conversation. Let me share one basic point about God's judgment and answer one objection to God's judgment. And let me do both of those things with material taken from a chapter entitled God the Judge in Packer's classic book, Knowing God. First, a point about God's judgment. Packer says that the heart of the justice which expresses God's nature is retribution, the rendering to persons what they have deserved. For this is the essence of the judge's task, to reward good with good and evil with evil is natural to God. Packer goes on to say about the retributive nature of God that this is one of the basic facts of life, and being made in God's image, we all know in our hearts that this is right. This is how it ought to be. Having made the basic point about God's judgment, let me answer a question about God's judgment that's on many minds today. If God's retributive justice is really how the world should be, why do we shy away from the thought of God as judge? Why do we feel that judgment is unworthy of him? Packer answers this question with another question. Would a God who didn't care about right and wrong be an admirable being? Would a God who put no distinction between the beasts of history, the Hitlers and the Stalins, and his own saints be a morally praiseworthy and perfect person? Moral indifference would be an imperfection in God, not a perfection. The final proof that God is a perfect moral being is the fact that he's committed himself to judge the world. Thank you, Dr. Packer. So it turns out that human beings are wired to long for fair judgments. And it turns out that God is the only truly fair judge. I hope that this brief look at the judgment of God leaves you persuaded, along with Abraham in Genesis 18:25, will not the judge of all the earth do right? So God, the righteous judge, he's going to destroy Sodom for its all too evident gross sinfulness. But he won't do so before he's rescued Abram's nephew Lot. We see, beginning verse 12, how the angels warn Lot of the coming danger. They urge him to leave the city, and they finally drag him to safety. Do you remember when Abram was bargaining with God? He asked God to spare the city if only 10 righteous people could be found there. Well, it turns out there aren't 10. And it turns out that Lot and his wee family are far from righteous. Did you see how they're portrayed in chapter 19? Remember where we found Lot in verse 1? That's right. At the city gate. That means he's on the city council. Lot's up to his neck in Sodom's vile culture. The sons-in-law, when they're invited to flee from God's judgment, they're not interested. They think it's all a big joke. Lot, his wife, and his daughters, all of them together seem to be dragging their feet. It takes the angels to drag them from the city to finally save them. Whenever the angels tell them to get to the mountains, get some distance between you and this city and God's judgment, Lot asks in verse 20 whether he can be allowed to stop in a nearby town. If this guy escapes God's judgment, it's going to be only by the skin of his teeth and only in spite of himself. And when the judgment finally falls, Lot's wife is so busy looking back to sinful, vile Sodom that she loves so much that God's judgment envelops her too. Folks, there weren't 10 righteous people in Sodom. There weren't even 4 or 3. The 3 who do escape do so reluctantly because God, in his grace, pretty much drags them to safety. If you have any remaining doubts about the morality of Lot and his daughters, there's an episode at the end of the chapter that just about says it all. Sodom is vile. Lot and his family are sinful. And yet, in his grace, God saves Lot from destruction for Abram's sake. Folks, this is still how God works today. God, the righteous judge, chooses to save vile and sinful people who trust in Jesus by his grace. At one point in Knowing God, Dr. Packer tells us how we sinful people should live in the light of God's coming judgment. He says, the New Testament's clear. Call on the coming judge to be your present Savior. As judge, he is the law, but as Savior, he is the gospel. Run from him now, and you'll meet him as your judge then, and without hope. Seek him now, and you'll find him, and you'll look forward to your future meeting with joy. Folks, we started this morning wondering, how should we respond to people who don't yet know Jesus? We realize that often we're judgmental, that we don't care for them as we might and as we should. Perhaps it's because we've forgotten that we're vile and sinful ourselves, and that we've been saved from God's righteous judgment only by God's grace. When we remember that, and to the extent that we do, we'll see others more as Abram did. We leave the judgment to God, and we'll plead for sinners that they would respond to God's amazing grace.